And so, guys, existence is not part of the description of a thing. And Anselm wants us to buy the idea that existence is part of the description of God. He wants us to believe that God is definitionally existent, that God is defined as he who necessarily exists. But as I've demonstrated with the teddy bear example, with Kant's 100 failures, and with the pen example, existence cannot be part of the definition of an entity or an object or a being. Hello everybody, you are listening to the Magic Skeptic, aka Magic Dara, and you are all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. So in the recent weeks, I produced a video which detailed what I believe to be one of the worst arguments that atheists could possibly use. In other words, one of the worst arguments against God's existence. So I thought it would only be fitting to produce a video where I detail what I believe to be one of the worst arguments in favor of God's existence. So if you're ready to explore one of the worst arguments, and yet one of the arguments which can still be quite deceptive and persuasive, let's get right into it and unpack this argument. It is known as the ontological argument. The ontological argument was first proposed by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. And it has more or less persisted to this day. It crops up again and again in different forms, but usually the mistakes at the epicenter of the argument largely remain the same. So what is the ontological argument? Because ontological for most non-philosophers is a word that probably means little to nothing. So what is it? Well, the ontological argument, guys, is an attempt to prove God's existence using nothing other than logic. Other arguments for God's existence seek to demonstrate the existence of the divine with reference to the world around us. In other words, those arguments deal with what you might call physical evidence. Arguments such as the cosmological argument, arguments such as the design argument, and so forth. If you don't know what any of those arguments are, I can make videos on them, and if you want to hear about those arguments, jump into the comments below and let me know. But suffice to say, there are arguments which seek to show the existence of God using observation, using empiricism. Now, in my view, as an atheist, these arguments fail. But what makes the ontological argument so interesting is that it doesn't bother with any of that stuff. It ignores empiricism, the scientific method, and observation. It uses logic and logic alone. And so if this argument is successful, it will have proved the existence of God using nothing other than human cognition. Sounds interesting, right? Well, let's dive right in and let me explain or just lay out Anselm's argument before we go any further. And while you listen, I want you to ask yourself, would this argument convince you? Here we go. So what you're about to hear is a summary of Anselm's argument, which is presented here in modern English, just so you're aware. And it begins with point 1, which says, God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so, in other words, Anselm here is arguing that God is the greatest possible being that a person could think of. And if you could think of a being that was greater, then that would be God, definitionally speaking. And so we move on to point 2. This is a definition, argues Anselm, which even a fool understands in his mind, even though he does not understand it to exist in reality. Point 3. There is a difference between having an idea in the mind and knowing that this idea exists in reality. Point 4. For example, a painter has an idea in his mind of what he wants to paint, but when he has painted it, that idea now exists both in his mind and in reality. And now we get to the core of the argument. Point 5. It is greater to exist both in the mind and in reality than to exist only in the mind. Point 6. If God existed only in the mind, I could think of something greater, namely a God who existed in reality also. Conclusion. Therefore, in order to be the greatest conceivable being, or the greatest being any human being can think of, God must exist both in the mind and in reality as well. So what do you think? Are you convinced? Does this argument strike you as persuasive? Are you now a theist? Have you just fallen to your knees and accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Well, I certainly hope not, because as I've already alluded to, I believe that this is the single worst argument for the existence of God that has ever been proposed. The worst. Absolutely the bottom of the barrel. And so let's get into it and figure out why this argument is in fact so bad. And of course, that story begins with a contemporary of Anselm himself, and that is none other than Guanilo. So at the surface, the argument appears to work, doesn't it? The logic seems to run through there. So if you're to summarize the 5 or 6 points in conclusion of Anselm's argument, you could summarize it like this. God is the greatest being we can think of. It would be greater to exist both in reality and in the mind, as opposed to only existing in the mind. So because we can think of God as the greatest being, therefore he must exist in reality as well. Otherwise, he's not the greatest being we're thinking of. It sounds like a bit of a tongue tie, doesn't it? But yeah, that's the argument in a nutshell. If God really is the greatest conceivable being, then he must exist in reality, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be the greatest being you could think of. It would obviously be greater to exist both in reality and in the mind. And so enter Guanilo, who was a contemporary of Anselm. And it was Guanilo who really tore this argument to shreds, and it's quite fitting that Guanilo was a contemporary of Anselm himself. Guanilo used an analogy, the analogy of the lost perfect island, and he applied the exact same logic to the lost perfect island that Anselm applied to God. Guanilo reasoned that he can conceive of the most perfect lost island. And so if it really was the most perfect, it would be more perfect if it existed both in reality and in the mind, as opposed to only in the mind. If this lost perfect island only existed in the mind, then it wouldn't be the most perfect lost island, would it? It would have to exist in reality as well. So because I can conceive or think of this most perfect lost island, therefore it must exist in reality as well. And so Anselm's argument is revealed to be the fallacious nonsense that it is. The truth is, you could apply Anselm's thinking, the logic here, to any possible proposition. And this is exactly what Guanilo argued. Anselm, of course, responded to Guanilo's criticism. And in my view, Anselm's response leaves a lot to be desired. Anselm argued that it is impossible to quantify the idea of a perfect island. How many trees must it have to be perfect? If you decided on a number and then changed your mind and added one more, would that number still be perfect? If your perfect drink is a tequila sunrise, but after a few years of drinking you grow to dislike the taste and change to lemonade, what has become of your perfect drink? We can formulate Anselm's response to Guanilo in the following way. To be perfect, an island would have to be that island which no greater can be conceived. An island than which no greater can be conceived would have to exist necessarily, since a contingent island would be less perfect than an island that existed necessarily. But islands are contingent and so cannot exist necessarily. Conclusion: therefore, the logic of the argument related to a perfect island does not apply to God. Anselm responded and said, but Guanilo, your perfect lost island is contingent. Islands are contingent. Now, what does contingent mean? A contingent object relies on something else for its existence. So I am a contingent being. I rely on all sorts of things for my existence to continue, or for my existence to have even come into being in the first place. So I relied on my parents having sex together and me being born. Now that I am alive, I am born and living. I rely on food, I rely on oxygen, and all sorts of things. And were any of those things taken away, the things upon which my life is contingent, my life would end. Right? And so this was Anselm's response to Guanilo. He said, but Guanilo, your lost perfect island couldn't possibly be perfect because it's contingent. It relies on all sorts of other factors. The palm trees will eventually rot. The bar, however beautiful it is on this island resort, will eventually give way to erosion. If it's made of wood, the wood will eventually biodegrade. If it's made of metal, the metal will eventually rust, etc., etc. So there cannot be a perfect island. Anselm pointed out that how many trees would the perfect island have? Would it have 20 trees? Would it have 24 trees? And if it had 24 and one died, would it now cease to be the perfect island now that it had 23? You see, the island analogy, argued Anselm, doesn't work because islands are contingent and they are in a state of flux and change. They are subject to impermanence, as a Buddhist might argue. Nothing will last forever on this island. And this does not apply to God. God, argued Anselm, is non-contingent, and so can be truly perfect. God doesn't rely on anything else for his existence. God is a perfect being that is forever, an infinitely existing being that exists outside of space and time. He is the pinnacle of perfection. His nature is perfection. The nature of any island could not possibly be perfection because it is contingent. It is reliant on other factors for its continued existence. But you see, guys, this is just an assertion. Anselm is asserting that God is non-contingent. How did he ever demonstrate that? You can't just assert that because God is perfect, therefore he's non-contingent. Because that's exactly what Guanilo is doing with his island. You see, Anselm is erecting a straw man of Guanilo's response. He's pointing out that, islands are contingent, so how could it be perfect? Because if it was true perfection, it would exist necessarily. And islands don't exist necessarily. And yes, he's right, islands don't exist necessarily. They are contingent. The bar at an island will eventually biodegrade, if indeed it's made of wood. If it's made of metal, it will eventually rust. The trees will eventually fall down, be blown over by the wind, or rot. So yes, islands are not necessary entities. They don't exist necessarily. But that wasn't Guanilo's point. Guanilo was articulating the idea of a lost, perfect island. This is an island that has metaphysical necessity. This is an island that is non-contingent. It has to be. It's perfect. It is the lost perfect island, and part of its perfection is its necessary existence. So Anselm's response don't work. Anselm is attacking the idea of a contingent island, whereas Guanilo was articulating the idea of a necessarily existent, non-contingent, perfect island. And its perfection means that it exists necessarily and is not subject to the laws of biology and chemistry and physics, and it's not going to biodegrade. It's that simple. You see, Guanilo is playing Anselm's game against him. Anselm is going to claim, but God must exist because existence is part of his perfection. Well, existence is part of the perfection of the lost perfect island as well. Anselm is going to claim that, but God is necessarily existent. Necessarily. In other words, it is impossible to conceive of this God not existing, because existence is part of his perfection. Well, so too it is true about the lost perfect island. It all runs through. It's the exact same. The non-existence of the lost perfect island is a contradiction in terms, according to Guanilo, because existence is part of its perfection. You see, guys, Anselm is erecting a straw man of Guanilo and knocking it over and declaring victory. But God is metaphysically necessary, islands are not. True, islands aren't, but Guanilo's lost perfect island is necessary. And so all of the same attributes that Anselm gives to the God proposition, Guanilo simply gives to the island proposition, because both are examples of perfection, than which nothing greater can be conceived. Remember, Guanilo has articulated the most perfect island, the island than which no greater can be conceived. And so all of the same logic applies to Guanilo's proposition. It's that simple. Anselm is simply defining God as non-contingent. How did Anselm get to the conclusion that God is non-contingent? And if he's simply going to say God would have to be non-contingent, that doesn't get us anywhere, because Guanilo's perfect island has to be non-contingent. Guanilo's perfect island has to be an exception to the rules of erosion and biodegradation and so forth. You see, the analogy can run no matter what. And if you're not happy with the island analogy, just apply Anselm's ontological argument to literally any other god. Any other god. Or any other divine proposition. You see, of course, Anselm is assuming the Christian God, but couldn't Anselm's ontological argument be equally applied to Zeus? Couldn't it be equally applied to various other gods throughout history? Why not? You see, it doesn't get us to the Christian God if it ever got us anywhere at all. Guanilo's response holds here, Anselm. And while Anselm can't hear me, I'm sorry I have to say to a dead man, you are wrong. You are mistaken. You are merely asserting that God exists. But the problems with the ontological argument run deeper. And it was Immanuel Kant who pointed out the problem at the epicenter of this argument. Before we jump into Kant, it's very important that I point out that Kant was not addressing Anselm's ontological argument directly. Rather, he was addressing a latter version of the argument that was proposed by René Descartes. That said, Kant's criticisms apply more or less to both gentlemen. They apply both to René Descartes and Anselm's versions of the ontological argument. And so, with that acknowledged, let's dive right in. It was Kant who pointed out that existence is not a predicate. Now, what is a predicate, guys? A predicate is part of the description of a thing. If I said that I am wearing a pink t-shirt, or salmon for those of you who are in denial, the salmon or the pink there is a predicate. It's a predicate of the t-shirt. It's part of the description of a thing. If I said, look over there at that blue car, blue in that sentence is the predicate. If you look at Anselm's ontological argument, or René Descartes later on, which I'm not going to get into right now because it will just elongate the video, and frankly, we've got enough on the table already. But if you look at Anselm's argument, you will see that he's treating existence as part of the description of a thing, and that is entirely inappropriate. Let me explain with an example. An example always helps to clarify these points. So if I started describing a cow to you, if I said, oh, the cow is black and white, the cow is about this tall, the cow makes a moo noise, the cow exists, the cow... You see what happened there? Isn't that strange that I described its existence as part of the description of the thing? Isn't that odd? Let's flip the script with a non-existent object, or allegedly non-existent object, or entity, and let's talk about unicorns. If I started describing a unicorn, I said a unicorn looks a lot like a horse. This unicorn that I'm thinking of is white. It's got wings. It's got a horn protruding from its head. It doesn't exist. It's also got very soft fur. You see the problem there? Again, when I describe it as non-existent, I'm not telling you anything about the unicorn itself and the description of it. I'm telling you something else. A good analogy for understanding this is geography. Again, if I go back to describing the cow and I say the cow is black and white, the cow is this tall, the cow makes a moo noise, the cow is in Ireland, the cow is... You see the problem there? When I told you the cow is in Ireland, I wasn't actually telling you anything about the cow itself as an entity. I was telling you something surrounding the cow. I was telling you where the cow is. If I told you right now that I'm thinking of a random object in my head, I've got a random object in my mind, and it's in India, you haven't learned anything about the object, have you? You don't know anything about what I'm thinking about because I've told you that it's in India. If you want to know, I was thinking of a pen. A pen, something that you write with. Okay? Telling you that it was in India doesn't tell you anything about the pen. Similarly, if I tell you right now I'm thinking of an object and I say, by the way, it doesn't exist, that doesn't tell you anything about what the object is. Right now, I'm actually thinking of that same pen, which doesn't exist. Pens do exist, but this specific pen I'm thinking of doesn't. It just doesn't. You know how I know that? Because I was thinking of a pen with my face on it. And I know that there is no such pen with my face on it. But telling you that it doesn't exist doesn't tell you anything about the object that's in my mind. It doesn't even hint at what the object might be. Why? Because existence is not part of the description of a thing. This is what Kant pointed out. Existence is not a predicate. Why does this matter? Well, if you look at Anselm's ontological argument again, specifically when he says that it is greater for God to exist both in reality and in the mind, as opposed to only existing in the mind. Well, that statement there treats existence as though it is part of the greatness of a thing, and it simply isn't. So Kant uses the example of 100 thalers, which was a coin that was used at the time he was alive. He said that if you imagine 100 thalers, that imaginary set of 100 thalers is principally the same as 100 existent thalers. Now, obviously, we can spend the existent thalers and we can't spend the imaginary thalers, but the predicates for both objects are identical. They're the same. There's 100 of them. If I take away one of my imaginary thalers, I have 99 left. If I take away one of my 100 existent thalers, I have 99 left. My 100 imaginary thalers are composed of metal, just like my 100 existent thalers are, etc., etc. The shape, the color, the size, the smell, all of the rest of it is identical. The only difference between the two sets of thalers is that one set exists and the other set does not. And if you're going to say that they're not identical, then you're not imagining the same objects as those that exist. But please notice that the existence or lack thereof of either set of thalers tells us nothing about the thalers themselves. If I tell you that I'm thinking of something and that it exists, just like I did with the pen example a moment ago, I've told you nothing about the object. Similarly, if I tell you that I'm thinking of an object and it doesn't exist, I've told you nothing about the object. Its existence is arguably an external factor. Now, you might suggest as a response, but Magic Skeptic, if I tell you that I'm thinking of an object that's red, I haven't told you anything about the object either. You're no closer to knowing what I'm thinking of at the same time. And that sounds like a fair response, but the truth is you have actually told me something about the object itself, something that's intrinsic to the object's being. You've told me that it's red. So let's imagine you're thinking of a red ball. I still know that redness is part of the description of it, whereas existence, or the lack thereof, is not part of the description of something. Telling me whether or not something exists doesn't describe anything about the object itself. It doesn't tell me about whether or not it's red, to take the example we just went through. It doesn't tell me what weight it is. It doesn't tell me how it smells, how it feels, how it tastes, etc. I have learned nothing by being told that something exists or doesn't exist. Whereas telling me that it's red does in fact tell me something about the object itself. And just to make this absolutely clear, I'll run through one more example that I often use myself, and that is the example of a teddy bear. So I have an example of an imaginary teddy bear in my mind, and it is identical to a teddy bear that my fiancé owns. Both teddy bears are exact replicas of one another. The imaginary teddy bear in my mind is soft, it's light, it's cuddly, exactly the same as the existent teddy bear. The predicates of both are identical. It's just that one exists and one doesn't. Again, going back to the geography example, let's imagine we had two existent cuddly, soft and light teddy bears, one in India and one here in the UK. Both are identical. Their location on the earth is irrelevant. It doesn't tell me anything about the teddy bears. Both are identical. They're both soft. They're both cuddly. They're both brown, for example. Telling me that one is in India and one is in the UK is utterly irrelevant. That fact is external to the teddy bear itself, just like the existence of said teddy bears is an external issue. And so, guys, existence is not part of the description of a thing. And Anselm wants us to buy the idea that existence is part of the description of God. He wants us to believe that God is definitionally existent, that God is defined as he who necessarily exists. But as I've demonstrated with the teddy bear example, with Kant's 100 failures, and with the pen example, existence cannot be part of the definition of an entity or an object or a being, because existence adds nothing to the description of that thing. To include existence as part of the definition of an entity is to be engaged in a category error, or, as I would rather put it, a fool's errand. And so, guys, we don't get to treat existence as part of the description of a thing. And that is the problem with the ontological argument. It is the core issue. Anselm is attempting to define God into existence by asserting that necessary existence is part of his definition. But you cannot use existence as part of the description of a thing, certainly not necessary existence, because if Anselm can do it for God, Guanilo can do it for the island, and I can do it for whatever the hell I want. Necessary existence cannot be part of the definition of something. And this is the problem. Logic cannot be used to verify the existence of things, which is why the ontological argument was a failed enterprise from the word go. To demonstrate the existence of something, we must observe evidence for it in reality, whether it be trace evidence, a footprint left behind, cosmic microwave background radiation for the Big Bang. No, we don't need to observe something directly. We can use indirect evidence, and there's no problem with that. What we cannot do is sit on an armchair and simply use logic to get to the conclusion that something exists. And if you think there is an example that contradicts the claim I've just made, please jump into the comments below and make me aware, because you will have taught me something, if indeed you can come up with a counterpoint. But beware, if you do think you have thought of a logical argument to prove that something exists, be careful, because what you might discover, and I suspect more than likely will discover, is that there is a smuggled in observational premise in your logical argument somewhere. There is something that you have observed. If you can prove something using logic and logic alone, then in theory, you should be able to prove the existence of that thing in a dark room with no windows, using nothing other than your mind. And so ask yourself, is the thing that you believe you've proven to exist using logic and logic alone, is that something that you could have proven to exist in that dark room without any windows? Because I'm not convinced that you can do that. I'm not convinced that Anselm did it either. Using logic to demonstrate the existence of God is fallacious in the extreme. It's fallacious, as Guanilo's reductio ad absurdum demonstrates, whereby we can apply that logic to any metaphysically perfect or greatest conceivable entity in any conceivable domain. But it's also fallacious in the sense that it treats existence as though it is part of the description of a thing. And lastly, it is fallacious in the sense that it seeks to define God into existence by asserting that necessary existence is part of the definition of God. But we could use necessary existence as part of the definition of anything. And in so doing, we would have achieved exactly what Anselm achieved with his argument, which is precisely nothing. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do smash that like button, because I don't have a Patreon, I'm not monetized yet, and so forth, and so it would just mean the world to me as a little payment for the production of these videos if you would just hit that like button. It doesn't cost you anything, and it matters so much to me and my channel. So yeah, if you could do that for me, I would sincerely appreciate it. Other than that, if you have been enjoying my content more generally, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and join the Magic Skeptic community. It's a growing community, and we would love to have you. If you do hit the subscribe button, don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even receive personal notifications as and when my latest videos go live. But other than that, guys, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.